The alarm did not wake me. The silence did. 1 second the station was humming with the low sound of recycled air and distant voices. The next second there was nothing. No hum, no voices, just my own heartbeat, loud in my ears, and the red emergency light spinning slowly across the ceiling of the medical bay. My name is Daniel Cole. 3 hours earlier I was a communications officer on Halden Station, a small research outpost near the edge of human space. 3 hours earlier I had a job that mostly meant listening to static and passing messages between ships. 3 hours earlier, I did not know what it felt like to watch an entire world go quiet. I pushed myself up from the floor. My head throbbed. There was a cut above my eyebrow that had already dried. I did not remember falling. I did not remember much of anything after the first flash of light through the observation window. The station had been hosting a delegation, guests from a species we had only recently begun speaking with, calling themselves the Veyrun. They came with soft voices and slow, careful movements, and our diplomats had been thrilled. Contact without conflict, they said. Proof that Earth could build bridges instead of walls. I remember Laura Bennett, our station director, greeting them personally at the docking bay. I remember her laughing at something one of them said. I remember thinking that maybe, finally, the galaxy was going to be kind to us. I was wrong. I walked out of the medical bay into a corridor lit only by the pulsing emergency lights. The floor was littered with debris, chairs overturned, a data terminal sparking weakly against the wall. I called out for anyone. No one answered. At the end of the corridor, the observation deck doors were open, torn from their frame. I do not like to describe what I saw there in detail. I will only say this: the guests we had welcomed were gone, and so was almost everyone who had gone to greet them. The deck itself looked as though something enormous had passed through it without slowing down. I found Ethan Price near the far wall, alive, pressing a torn piece of his uniform against a wound on his arm. He was younger than me, barely out of training, and his eyes were wide with the kind of fear that does not fully understand what it is looking at yet. They turned on us, he said, the Veyrun, right in the middle of the welcome speech. No warning, nothing. He did not answer. He did not need to. We moved through the station together, checking every room we passed, calling out names that no one answered. Grace Miller, our systems engineer, we found sealed inside a maintenance closet, alive, shaking, clutching a wrench like it might protect her. Oliver Hart, one of our security officers, we found holding the line at a blast door that had somehow kept a section of the station intact. He had a burn along one side of his face and a stare that told me he had seen more than the rest of us combined. The Veyrun ships left 20 minutes ago, Oliver said. Didn't finish the job. I don't know why. Maybe they didn't need to, Ethan said quietly. We gathered what was left of us in the station's small command room. 6 of us, out of a crew and delegation of nearly 200. The main console was still functioning, barely, running on backup power. Grace worked quickly to restore what systems she could, her hands trembling but steady enough to do the work. The first thing that came back online was the long-range communication array. The second thing we saw was the silence from Earth. Normally, a station like ours received a steady stream of updates from Earth Command, routine check-ins, supply schedules, diplomatic bulletins. When Grace pulled up the channel, there was nothing, not static, not an error message. A deliberate quiet, the kind that comes from a choice, not a malfunction. That's not right, Grace said. Even if the network was down, there would be some kind of automated signal. This isn't down, this is off. I stared at the blank display for a long moment. Somewhere out there, ships full of families were sending distress calls into a void, waiting for answers that used to come within minutes. I had grown up believing Earth always answered, Earth always sent help, Earth always followed the rules, even when the rules were unfair, because that was who we were, the peaceful species, the patient one, the one who kept trying to be liked by a galaxy that mostly saw us as new and small and easy to underestimate. For the first time in my life, I wondered if that was about to change. Oliver moved to the console beside Grace. Checking a secondary channel meant only for military use. He entered a code I did not recognize, one clearly above my clearance, and after a moment, the screen flickered to life with a single line of text. Hold position. Do not respond to further contact from Veyrun vessels. Rescue inbound. No explanation, no comfort. Just an order, clipped and cold in a way Earth Command had never spoken to us before. "That's it?" Ethan asked. "That's all they're going to tell us?" Oliver did not answer right away. He was reading the message again, as if trying to find something hidden underneath the words. Finally he said, "I don't think they're being careless. I think they're being careful about something we don't understand yet." We waited. There was nothing else to do. Grace kept working on restoring life support to more sections of the station, in case there were still survivors trapped somewhere we hadn't reached. Ethan sat with his back against the wall, holding his injured arm, staring at nothing. I stayed by the console, watching the blank comm channel, hoping it would fill with something, anything, that sounded like the Earth I remembered. It was nearly 2 hours later when the rescue ship arrived. Not a diplomatic shuttle, not a slow supply hauler, a sleek combat vessel, faster and sharper than anything I had seen fly under Earth's colors before, gliding into docking range with a precision that felt almost unnatural for how quickly it had traveled. The woman who came through the airlock wore a uniform I did not recognize, dark and unmarked except for a small insignia over her heart. She introduced herself as Commander Nora Bishop, and she did not waste time with comfort. "How many survivors?" she asked. "6, I said. "Maybe more, if there are people still trapped in the lower decks." She nodded once, already relaying orders through a small comm device on her wrist, calling in a search team behind her. Then she looked around the ruined command room, at the blank Earth channel still glowing faintly on the console, and something in her expression shifted. Not sadness, something colder and more focused. "You've been asking why Earth went quiet," she said, without me having said anything at all. "Yes," I admitted. "Because we were listening," she said, "to everything, every station, every colony, every ship that sent a distress call in the last 6 hours. We didn't answer right away, because we were counting." "Counting what?" She turned to look at me directly, and for the first time I saw exhaustion behind her eyes, deep and old, like she had been carrying something heavy for a very long time and had only just set it down. "Counting how many times we said please," she said. "How many times we asked permission to defend ourselves. How many treaties we signed that only ever seemed to protect the other side. We've been counting that for years. Daniel Cole. Today, we stopped." I did not fully understand what she meant. Not yet. I only knew that something enormous had shifted somewhere far above my understanding, in rooms I would never see, among people who had apparently been planning for a day like this long before I ever set foot on Halden Station. Grace finally managed to restore the main viewing screen, and for a moment none of us spoke, because there, scrolling across every emergency channel in human space, was a message unlike anything Earth had ever broadcast before. Not a request, not an apology, not a plea for calm. Just 8 words, sent to every ship, every station, every ally, and every enemy across the stars. "We are done being civilized." Commander Bishop watched the message play once, twice, a third time, and then she turned back to us, with something that was not quite a smile and not quite grief, but sat somewhere painfully between the two. "Get your people ready," she said. "Things are about to move very fast." I did not know yet what those words would come to mean. I did not know that the galaxy that had underestimated us for decades was about to learn exactly how much restraint Earth had been quietly, carefully, deliberately holding back. I only knew that the silence was over, and whatever came next, there was no going back to the world I had woken up in that morning. There is a particular kind of fear that comes from realizing the people who are supposed to protect you have been holding something back the entire time you've known them. Not because they wanted to deceive you, but because they were waiting for a reason strong enough to let it go. I felt that fear on the transport ship that carried the 6 of us survivors away from Halden Station. Commander Nora Bishop sat across from me, her posture straight, her eyes distant, watching a small display that scrolled data faster than I could read. "You keep saying we were holding back," I said. "Holding back what exactly?" She glanced at me, weighing how much to say. Then, perhaps because I had just lived through something that earned me an answer, she spoke. "Everything," she said. "For almost 40 years, Earth has followed something called the CivilizedHFY Accord. It's the framework most of known space uses to settle disputes, define territory, and limit what any single species is allowed to develop. Weapons, ship classes, certain kinds of artificial intelligence, even some biological research, all capped, all monitored." "That sounds reasonable," I said carefully. "It would be," she said, "if everyone followed it the same way. But species like the Veyroon learned how to work around it decades ago. They kept their worst developments just outside the lines the Accord drew. Technically legal, practically dangerous. Earth, on the other hand, followed the rules exactly as written. We thought that if we proved ourselves trustworthy, if we were the one species that never cheated, eventually the rest of the galaxy would trust us in return." "Did it work?" Her mouth tightened. "For a while it looked like it might. We built relationships. Trade routes, a seat at the Tyrell Assembly, which is the closest thing this part of the galaxy has to a shared government. We were proud of that seat. We fought for it with patience instead of strength, and for years that felt like the smarter path. And now? Now the species that smiled at that assembly table sent an unmarked fleet to slaughter a diplomatic station that was under Ashari protection," she said. "They broke the one rule that was supposed to be untouchable, direct violence against a protected outpost, and they did it assuming Earth would do what it always does. File a complaint, wait for a ruling, ask permission to respond." I thought of Laura Bennett laughing at the docking bay, hours before she disappeared, along with almost everyone she had gone to greet. "What changed?" I asked. "Why announce this now instead of just retaliating quietly?" Bishop was quiet for a moment, watching the stars slide past the viewport. "Because for years, our military command argued that the only way to survive in this galaxy long-term wasn't through more patience," she said. "It was through being taken seriously. And you can't be taken seriously if the only thing anyone has ever seen from you is restraint." The transport eventually delivered us to a much larger vessel waiting in the outer system, a command ship called the Halcyon, far larger and more heavily built than anything I had known Earth to field before. As we boarded, I noticed something odd. The crew moving through its corridors did not have the look of soldiers preparing for a difficult, uncertain fight. They moved like people executing a plan they had rehearsed for years, waiting only for the order to begin. I was given a temporary post monitoring communications while the injured were treated and the survivors debriefed. It gave me access to channels I had never been cleared to see before, and it was there that I began to understand exactly how long this moment had been coming. There were files, old ones, development logs stretching back over a decade, describing programs with names that meant nothing to me on their own. Names like Steady Hand, and Long Silence, and Clear Sky. Reports on propulsion systems that exceeded anything publicly known. Notes on ship hulls built from materials that had supposedly been banned under the Ashari Accord for civilian use, quietly developed under military exception clauses that almost no one outside command had ever seen invoked. A young officer named Adam Cross noticed me reading and sat down across from me without asking permission, which told me he already knew what I was looking at. "You're wondering why none of this ever came up in the news," he said. "The thought crossed my mind," I admitted. "Because it wasn't supposed to," he said. "Command decided a long time ago that if Earth was ever going to actually use its full capability, the first time the galaxy heard about it needed to be the moment we used it, not years of warnings beforehand. Otherwise, every other species would have spent that same time figuring out how to counter it, or worse, decided to strike first before we finished building it. That's a big risk," I said, trusting no one would find out. "It was," Adam agreed, "but leaks are usually caused by people talking, and Command made sure almost no one below a certain rank knew enough to talk about anything specific. Most of what you're reading now, I only got cleared for an hour ago." I asked the question that had been sitting in my chest since Bishop's explanation on the transport ship. Why now? Why the Veyroon? And why this particular attack? Adam's expression sobered. Because Halden Station wasn't the only target, he said. In the last 6 hours, the Veyroon launched coordinated assaults against 4 separate human outposts along the border. 2 research stations, 1 supply depot, and a small colony of about 11,000 people called Marrow Point. My stomach dropped. 11,000 civilians. Most of them made it to shelters in time, he said quickly, seeing my face. Marrow Point had early warning systems most colonies don't, because Command had quietly upgraded them months ago, almost like they expected something like this. Losses there were far lower than the Veyroon clearly intended, but Halden wasn't so fortunate, and neither was the supply depot at Corrin's Reach. I thought about the observation deck on Halden Station, the debris, the silence where 200 people used to be. So this was planned, I said slowly. Not just by them, by us too. Somehow we knew this was coming. Command suspected the Veyroon were preparing something for months, Adam said. Increased fleet movement near the border, unusual troop rotations, a sudden interest in territory that had never mattered to them before. What we didn't know was when or how far they'd be willing to go. When Halden's signal went dark, that was the confirmation Command needed. The moment the first shot was fired against a protected outpost, every restriction we had voluntarily placed on ourselves for 40 years became void under Ashari's own emergency doctrine. So Earth didn't break the rules, I said, understanding now. No, Adam said. We used the rules. Just not the way anyone expected us to. The Accord has always allowed for a full release of restricted capability in the event of a confirmed unprovoked attack on protected territory. No species has ever invoked it, because no species has ever been attacked seriously enough to need it. Until today. I sat with that for a long moment. It explained the strange calm on the ship, the sense that everyone around me had been waiting for this exact moment far longer than I had been aware there was anything to wait for. Grace Miller found me later in a small mess hall near the crew quarters, her uniform replaced with a spare set that fit poorly across the shoulders. She looked tired, in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. I keep thinking about Laura, she said quietly, sitting across from me. She trusted them. She really believed we were finally going to be treated like equals. I know, I said. Do you think this is right? She asked. All of this. Whatever we're becoming. I did not have an answer for her, not yet. I had grown up believing that patience was a virtue, that restraint made us better than the species who threatened us. I still believed that, somewhere underneath the fear and the grief. But I had also watched an observation deck reduced to wreckage, had heard Commander Bishop describe years of quietly counted humiliations, had read files describing weapons kept secret, not out of dishonesty, but out of the desperate hope they would never have to be used at all. I think, I said slowly, that we tried being patient for a very long time, and it cost us people like Laura. Grace was quiet for a moment. Then she asked the question that, I suspect, every person on that ship was asking themselves in their own private way. What happens now? Before I could answer, the ship's intercom crackled to life, and Commander Bishop's voice carried through every corridor of the Halcyon, calm and steady, in a way that somehow made the words that followed even more unsettling. All hands, prepare for translation to Veyroon border space. Command has authorized full engagement protocols. This is not a drill, and this is not a negotiation. We move in 6 hours. Grace looked at me across the table, her hands wrapped tightly around a cup of something that had long gone cold. I guess that answers that, she said. Outside the small viewport behind her, the stars had begun to shift, the ship's engines humming with a power I had never felt before, steady and enormous, like something ancient finally waking up after a very long sleep. The 6 hours before translation passed slower than any 6 hours I had ever lived through. I spent most of it in the communications bay, watching reports arrive from across human space. Marrow Point Colony, safe, though badly shaken. Corrin's Reach Supply Depot, a near-total loss. 23 confirmed dead, dozens more missing, and a growing stream of messages from other species across the Tyrell Assembly, confused, alarmed, some openly panicked at the 8 words Earth had broadcast to the galaxy. I read one message twice before I fully understood it. It came from a species called the Doran, longtime allies of Earth within the Assembly, cautious traders who had always respected our patience, even when they privately thought it made us weak. "We do not understand this declaration," the message read. "Please clarify intentions. We ask that humanity remember the value of measured response." Commander Bishop, standing nearby reviewing her own reports, read the message over my shoulder and allowed herself something close to a tired, humorless laugh. "They're worried," she said. "Good. They should be. For 40 years, everyone assumed measured meant harmless. They're about to learn the difference." I wanted to ask her what exactly was coming, but a large part of me suspected I would understand it far better once I saw it with my own eyes, instead of hearing it described in careful command language. So instead I asked something smaller. "What happens to people like me during this?" I asked. "I'm not a soldier. I run comms." "You'll keep running comms," she said. "Just faster, and for higher stakes than a supply schedule. Every person on this ship has a role in what's coming. Yours matters just as much as the person aiming a weapon." I did not entirely believe her, but I appreciated that she said it. Ethan Price found me an hour before translation, his arm now properly treated and secured in a light brace. He looked better than he had on Halden Station, though something in his eyes had not fully returned to where it used to be. "You scared?" he asked, sitting beside me. "Yes," I admitted. "You?" "Terrified," he said, with a small, humorless smile. "But also something else. I keep thinking about the people on that observation deck, about Laura. I keep thinking, if this is what it takes to make sure that never happens to anyone else, maybe being scared is worth it." I understood exactly what he meant, even if I was not entirely at peace with it yet. When translation finally came, it was nothing like I expected. No violent shudder, no dramatic flash of light through the viewport, just a soft hum through the deck plating, a brief pull at the center of my stomach, and then the stars outside the viewport rearranged themselves into an unfamiliar pattern. We had arrived at the edge of Veyroon border space. The main view screen in the command center, where I had been temporarily stationed to assist with communication traffic, filled with a view unlike anything I had ever seen from an Earth vessel. Behind the Halcyon, spreading out in careful formation, was a fleet larger and more advanced than anything I had known Earth possessed. Sleek combat ships, with hulls that seemed to bend light strangely at their edges. Massive support vessels bristling with equipment I did not recognize. And at the center of it all, something enormous and quiet, a ship so large it seemed to swallow the starlight around it, its surface marked with a single insignia I had only ever seen in the oldest historical archives from Earth's earliest, most idealistic years in space. "That's the Solace," Adam Cross said, appearing beside me, his voice hushed with something between awe and unease. "Command's flagship. Most of us have only ever seen pictures. It's been under construction for 11 years. 11 years, I repeated. Before any of this happened. Command didn't build all this because they knew exactly what would happen, Adam said. They built it because they knew something eventually would. They just made sure we'd be ready when it did." Commander Bishop moved to the center of the command deck, her expression calm, focused, entirely without the fear I felt sitting heavy in my own chest. She opened a channel that I understood, from the indicator lights around it, was broadcasting not just across our fleet, but across every Veyron vessel currently within range. "This is Commander Nora Bishop of Earth Fleet, aboard the combat vessel Halcyon," she said, her voice steady and clear. "6 hours ago, your forces conducted unprovoked and unauthorized action against protected human territory under Ashari Accord jurisdiction. 4 separate outposts. Hundreds of confirmed losses among diplomatic and civilian personnel." There was a pause, static crackling faintly as the channel remained open, waiting. "Under Article 12 of the Accord, this action constitutes grounds for full release from voluntary restriction," she continued. Effective immediately, Earth withdraws from all self-imposed limitations previously honored under that accord. We are not here to negotiate a response. We are here to deliver one. The silence that followed felt different from the silence on Halden Station. That silence had been empty, hollow, full of absence. This silence was full of something else. Attention. Fear perhaps from ships that had spent decades assuming they understood exactly how far Earth was willing to go. A response came a few minutes later. A Veyron voice, clipped and formal, demanding clarification, insisting the attack had been the action of a rogue faction, not sanctioned by their central command. Bishop's expression did not change. "That claim will be evaluated," she said simply. "In the meantime, stand down all vessels currently within this system and prepare to be boarded for verification. Any vessel that does not comply within 10 minutes will be treated as a continuing threat." 10 minutes. I watched the countdown appear on a secondary display, ticking downward with a calm precision that felt almost cruel in how ordinary it looked. Around the 8-minute mark, sensor readings across the command deck lit up. Several Veyron vessels, instead of standing down, began powering weapons systems, moving into what our tactical officers quickly identified as an attack formation. "They're not standing down," a young tactical officer named Ivy Sutton reported, her voice tight. "Multiple vessels charging weapons. Estimated time to firing range, 4 minutes. Commander Bishop did not look alarmed. If anything, her posture relaxed slightly, as though this was the outcome she had expected all along. "Understood," she said. "All vessels, engage defensive posture. Fleet command, execute clear sky." I did not know what clear sky meant. Not specifically, though I had seen the name in the old development files Adam had shown me earlier. I understood what it meant only moments later, when the massive flagship Solus, silent until now, released a coordinated volley of something I had no name for, precise and overwhelming, directed not at the Veyron ships broadly, but with startling accuracy at the specific weapon systems those ships had just powered up. It was over in less than 90 seconds, not with the chaotic violence of the attack on Halden Station, but with a kind of terrible, controlled precision. Weapon systems disabled across nearly a dozen Veyron vessels simultaneously, their offensive capability neutralized before they had fired a single shot in return. No wild destruction, no unnecessary loss, just an overwhelming demonstration that the fight the Veyron had expected was not the fight they were going to get. The command deck was quiet for a long moment afterward. Then Ivy Sutton's voice broke the silence, unsteady with something between disbelief and relief. "Confirmed. All targeted Veyron weapon systems disabled. No further offensive capability detected among the responding vessels." Bishop nodded once, her expression unreadable. "Open the channel again," she told the communications officer beside me. When it opened, her voice was calm, almost gentle, in a way that somehow made the moment feel heavier rather than lighter. "You have your answer," she said to the Veyron fleet. "This was a demonstration, not our full response. Stand down, allow inspection, and account for those responsible for the attacks on protected human territory. This is the only opportunity you will be given." I watched the Veyron formation shift, ships drifting into a passive posture, weapons powering down across the fleet. Whatever confidence had led them into that attack formation minutes earlier had clearly evaporated the moment they understood exactly what Earth had been holding back all this time. Grace Miller, who had been assisting with system diagnostics nearby, finally exhaled a breath she seemed to have been holding since the countdown began. "We didn't lose anyone," she said quietly, almost to herself. "Not one ship." "No," Adam Cross said beside her. "That was the point. Command didn't build this to prove we could match their strength. They built it to prove we never needed to." I stood there on the command deck of the Halcyon, watching a fleet that had attacked us without warning, now drifting quietly, defenseless, waiting to see what we would do next. I thought about Laura Bennett, about the observation deck, about the 8 words that had been broadcast across every channel in human space only hours earlier. "We are done being civilized." I understood now that those words had never meant Earth intended to become cruel. They meant Earth intended to stop pretending to be smaller than it was. And watching that Veyron fleet surrender its weapons without a single shot needing to be fired in return, I began to understand that there might be a difference between those two things after all. The days that followed the confrontation at the Veyron border moved quickly, faster than I could fully process at the time, though looking back now, I remember each moment with unusual clarity, the way people often remember the events that quietly reshape who they are. Earth fleet boarded and inspected the disabled Veyron vessels, confirming what many of us had already suspected. The attacks had not been the work of a rogue faction, as their central command initially claimed, but a coordinated operation, planned and authorized at the highest levels of Veyron leadership. Recordings recovered from one of the disabled command ships confirmed it plainly, officers discussing the attack in advance, confident that Earth's response would be limited to formal complaints and diplomatic pressure, exactly as it always had been before. I was present in the communications bay when Commander Bishop reviewed those recordings for the first time. She watched them without visible anger, though something in her expression tightened as the Veyron officer in the recording laughed about how predictable Earth's restraint had become. "They didn't expect us to fight back," she said quietly, almost to herself. "They expected us to ask for permission to be upset." The Toral Assembly convened an emergency session shortly afterward, and Earth was granted a place at the table that felt different from every previous appearance we had made there. Not the cautious, grateful presence of a species still trying to prove it belonged, but something quieter and firmer, a presence that no longer needed to ask. I was not present for that session personally, but Adam Cross, who had been assigned to monitor diplomatic channels during the proceedings, described it to me afterward in the mess hall, his voice still carrying a note of disbelief. Species that used to barely acknowledge our delegates were suddenly asking direct questions, he said, not about our intentions toward them specifically, about whether we'd consider extending protection agreements to their own borders. Overnight, humanity went from the polite species everyone quietly underestimated to the one nobody wanted to provoke. "That's what Bishop wanted," I said. "Not fear exactly, just to never be underestimated again." "I think it's more complicated for her than that," Adam said. "I've seen her read those recovered recordings 4 separate times since we boarded those ships. I don't think this feels like a victory to her. I think it feels like something she wishes had never been necessary." I understood that feeling more than I expected to, because despite everything, despite the vast and careful strength Earth had revealed, I found myself thinking constantly of Laura Bennett, of the empty observation deck, of Grace Miller's quiet question in the mess hall days earlier. What happens now? I did not think the answer was as simple as victory. That uncertainty became sharply personal a few days later, when I was assigned to accompany a small diplomatic party sent to negotiate directly with Veyron leadership regarding reparations and accountability for the attacks. Commander Bishop led the delegation herself, along with Grace, Ethan, and myself, chosen, I suspect, because we had lived through the attack ourselves and could speak to its consequences firsthand, in a way official reports could not fully capture. We met the Veyron delegation aboard a neutral station maintained by the Toral Assembly, a wide, circular structure built specifically for negotiations between species who did not entirely trust one another. The Veyron representative, an official named Tessic Vorin, entered the room with far less confidence than I remembered from the recordings of the attack's planning stages. Whatever certainty their leadership once had about Earth's limitations had clearly been replaced with something closer to caution. "We are prepared to discuss reparations," Vorin said carefully, after the formal introductions concluded, and to formally identify the officers responsible for authorizing the attacks. "Good," Bishop said evenly. "We'll also require full access to your border monitoring data for the past year, to confirm this was an isolated escalation and not the beginning of a broader pattern." Vorin hesitated. "That data includes sensitive military positioning." "So did the outposts your forces destroyed," Bishop replied, her voice calm but immovable. "This is not a negotiation over whether you will comply, Ambassador Vorin. It is a discussion of how quickly." I watched Vorin's expression shift, something between resentment and resignation settling into it. For the first time since the attack, I understood clearly what Adam had described. Earth was no longer being treated as a polite guest at that table. We were being treated as a species whose patience had a floor, and whose floor had just been located, decisively, by the very people who had underestimated it. During a brief recess in the negotiations, I found myself standing near a wide viewport overlooking the neutral station's central garden, a strange, quiet space filled with plants from a dozen different worlds, meant to remind delegates that peace, however fragile, was still the preferred outcome for everyone involved. Grace joined me there, her arms crossed, watching the garden without really seeing it. "Do you think this fixes anything?" she asked. "All of this, reparations, accountability, being taken seriously, does any of it actually fix what happened to Laura, or to everyone we lost?" "No," I said honestly. "I don't think it fixes it. I think it just makes sure it's harder for someone to decide it's worth doing again." Grace considered that for a long moment. "I keep thinking about something Bishop said, back on the Halcyon," she said. "About counting. How many times we said please," she said. "How many times we asked permission to defend ourselves." "I remember," I said. "I think that's what this is," Grace said slowly. "Not revenge, just refusing to keep counting." I thought that was probably the closest anyone had come to explaining, simply and honestly, exactly what had changed since the silence on Halden Station. Not cruelty, not even anger, not really, not anymore, just an end to a particular kind of quiet suffering Earth had been carrying for decades, disguised as patience. The negotiations concluded 3 days later, with terms that were, by every account I later heard, far more favorable to Earth than any agreement humanity had previously secured within the Torel Assembly. Full reparations for the outposts destroyed, formal accountability for the officers responsible, and, more significantly, an amendment to the Ashari Accord itself, one that permanently recognized Earth's right to maintain defensive capability without the previous restrictions that had quietly hobbled us for 40 years. Ethan, sitting beside me on the transport back toward Earth space once negotiations concluded, stared out the viewport with an expression I found difficult to read. "You okay?" I asked. "I don't know," he admitted. "Part of me is relieved. Part of me keeps thinking about what Voron said, right at the end, before we left." "What did he say?" "He asked Bishop if this meant Earth intended to become like everyone assumed the Veyroon already were," Ethan said quietly. "Aggressive, dangerous, a species other people needed to fear just to feel safe from us." "What did she say?" Ethan was quiet for a moment. "She said Earth intended to become a species that other people no longer felt safe attacking," he said. "And that whether or not that meant becoming something to fear was entirely up to how the rest of the galaxy chose to treat us going forward." I sat with that answer for a long time during the quiet journey home. I understood the logic of it, the careful, deliberate reasoning behind everything Earth had done since Halden Station fell silent. But some part of me, the part that still remembered Laura Bennett's laughter at the docking bay, could not fully separate strength from grief, could not entirely convince myself that the two things we had gained, respect and safety, were worth exactly what they had cost us to earn. I did not yet know, on that quiet transport home, that the hardest choice of everything I had lived through since the massacre was still waiting for me, only weeks away, in a moment that would force me to decide for myself which version of that new strength I actually believed in. The weeks following the negotiations passed with a strange, uneasy calm, the kind that settles over a place after something enormous has happened, but before anyone fully understands what comes next. Earth's presence across known space had shifted permanently. Other species approached us differently now, some with newfound respect, others with a caution bordering on fear. The Torel Assembly, once a place where our delegates quietly worked to prove humanity deserved a seat at all, now treated our representatives as equals whose positions carried real weight. It should have felt like everything we had hoped for, decades of patient diplomacy finally rewarded. Instead, I spent most of those weeks feeling unsettled in a way I struggled to explain, even to Grace, who had become something like a close friend in the aftermath of everything we had survived together. I was reassigned to a small outpost near the border, tasked with monitoring communications for a joint patrol operation meant to ensure the terms of the new Accord Amendment were being respected on both sides. It was there, nearly a month after the Veyroon negotiations concluded, that the choice I had been quietly dreading finally arrived. A distress signal came through late one evening, faint and broken, originating from a small, unregistered vessel drifting near the edge of patrolled territory. Our patrol ship, a modest vessel called the Amara, was the nearest responder, and Commander Bishop, who had taken personal command of border operations following the negotiations, ordered an immediate intercept. When we reached the vessel, we found it was Veyroon, badly damaged, clearly not military, carrying a small crew of civilians, attempting to flee Veyroon space entirely. Their leader, an older woman named Cyril Danth, explained through a shaking translator device that they were relatives of officers who had been identified as responsible for the attack on Halden Station, and that since the reparations agreement, they had faced increasing hostility and threats within Veyron territory, blamed by their own people for the humiliation Earth's response had caused. "We are not asking for forgiveness for what our family members did," Danth said, her voice unsteady. "We are asking only for somewhere safe to go. We have nowhere left." I watched Bishop's expression carefully as she listened. Under the new Accord Amendment, Earth had no formal obligation to assist Veyron civilians, especially those connected to the officers responsible for the original attack. Strictly speaking, we could turn them away entirely, and no one within the Assembly would have questioned that decision, given everything that had happened. But Bishop did not answer immediately. Instead, she turned to me, unexpectedly, and asked a question I had not anticipated. "You lived through what their relatives did to Halden Station," she said. "What do you think we should do?" I felt the weight of that question settle over me heavily. Part of me, the part still grieving Laura Bennett and everyone lost on that observation deck, wanted to say they deserved whatever consequences followed them home, that Earth owed nothing to the families of the people who had caused so much loss. But another part of me remembered Grace's words in that quiet garden weeks earlier. Not revenge, just refusing to keep counting. "I think," I said slowly, "that if we turn them away simply because of who their relatives are, we're punishing people for something they didn't do. And I think that's exactly the kind of thing we said we were done accepting, when we said we were done being civilized in the old way. Maybe being done with that old way doesn't mean stopping being fair. Maybe it just means being strong enough to choose fairness, instead of having it forced on us." Bishop studied me for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind her eyes. Then she turned back to Cyril Danth. "You'll be granted temporary refuge within neutral Assembly territory," she said. "Not out of obligation, out of choice. Earth is not interested in punishing people for crimes they did not commit." Danth's relief was immediate and visible, her shoulders sagging as though a great weight had finally lifted. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I did not expect this, given everything." "Neither did I, until a moment ago," Bishop admitted, glancing briefly toward me. Later, once the Veyroon civilians had been safely transferred and the Amara continued its patrol route, Bishop found me alone in the small communications bay, staring quietly out at the stars. "You surprised me back there," she said. "I surprised myself," I admitted. Some part of me wanted to say they deserve to be turned away. "But you didn't say that," Bishop said. "No," I said, "because I kept thinking about what all of this was actually supposed to mean. Being done, being civilized, I mean. If it just becomes an excuse to stop caring about fairness whenever it's convenient, then I'm not sure what we actually gained by refusing to be quiet anymore." Bishop was silent for a long moment, her gaze distant, thoughtful. "When Command first proposed the full release of our restricted capability," she said finally, "there were two very different arguments for why we should do it. One argument was that strength alone would earn us safety. The other was that strength without conscience just makes us another version of the very thing that attacked us in the first place." "Which argument won?" I asked. "Both, eventually," Bishop said. We built the strength. But every senior officer I respect made sure conscience came with it. What happened today, choosing fairness even when no one would have questioned cruelty, that's not a departure from what Earth decided to become. That's exactly what we were supposed to become, if we did this right. I thought about that for a long time afterward, turning it over quietly, as the Amara continued its slow patrol along the border. I thought about Laura Bennett, about the silence on Halden Station, about the 8 words broadcast across the stars that had changed everything for humanity in the span of a single day. We are done being civilized. I understood now, more clearly than I had in the chaos of that first day, that those words were never truly about abandoning kindness or fairness. They were about refusing to let kindness be mistaken for weakness ever again. About making sure that the next time some distant civilization considered whether attacking humanity might be easy, the answer would be an immediate and unmistakable no, not because Earth had become cruel, but because Earth had finally, painfully, learned exactly how much strength it had been quietly holding in reserve the entire time. Months later, the border outpost where I served received word that the Veyroon officers responsible for the original attacks had been formally removed from power, replaced by a new leadership more willing to engage honestly with the amended accord. Trade slowly resumed along the border. The Tyrell Assembly, still adjusting to Earth's new place within it, began drafting additional protections meant to prevent any species, including our own, from ever again exploiting the quiet vulnerabilities restraint had once created. I often think back to that first morning on Halden Station, waking to silence, finding Ethan bleeding quietly against the wall, discovering that Earth's answer to devastation was not immediate fury, but a long, deliberate pause before an answer far more complete than anyone expected. I think about Laura Bennett often, too. I like to believe that somewhere in the new Accord amendments, in the reparations paid, in the leadership replaced, in the small mercy shown to frightened civilians who had nowhere else to go, there is a version of justice that would have made sense to her. Not vengeance, just an ending to the particular kind of quiet suffering we had accepted for far too long, disguised as patience. Earth did not become cruel in the aftermath of that massacre. It became honest, about its strength and about its principles both, refusing any longer to hide either one behind a fear of being disliked by a galaxy that had for too long mistaken our kindness for an invitation. We are done being civilized, Earth had said, on the worst day in our history since we first reached the stars. What I understand now, standing at the edge of a border that finally feels safe in a way it never quite did before, is that those words were never the ending of who we were. They were simply the moment we finally decided to stop apologizing for it.